Good evening and welcome to this evening's program, Redistricting, What It Means for You. I am Mario, the president of the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to the members of the League's Redistricting Fair Elections Committee, led by Sept for the work they've done not only to produce this program, but for the countless hours that they spent educating our community about the redistricting process and why fair maps matter. Also, a profound thank you to our panel for sharing their time and expertise with us this evening. Last year, the Redistricting Fair Elections Committee made 16 presentations throughout Montgomery and Greene counties and produced a webinar to explain the redistricting process. Additionally, the committee hosted 8 map-making sessions to create community maps which were submitted to the Redistricting Commission, which was tasked with drawing the congressional and state district maps. The presentations and map-making sessions were conducted to prepare voters to testify about the needs of their communities. Dozens of League members joined other Ohio citizens to provide testimony before the Redistricting Commission at public forums, sent postcards to legislators, and attended rallies for fair districts at the State House. In spite of these efforts, the Commission approved maps which have been ruled unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court 3 times. And yet, these are the maps we must use in the upcoming elections. Tonight, our panel will discuss the history of gerrymandering in Ohio, the process that was used to draw the district maps we have now, and the changes that need to be made to ensure fair maps in the future. Later, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about how the maps may impact your choices at the polls. And now, I'd like to introduce League member Diane Herman, who will moderate this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Mario. Good evening again. I'm Diane Herman, and I'm Vice President of Voter Services for the Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area. And before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. The bathrooms are located when you go out to your right, past the elevators. Also, you will notice we have some maps with the new districts that you can look at after the program. Also, we have some water that's available. It was back there someplace. So hopefully it's right over there. So if you get parched during the program, please avail yourself of the water. Our panel of 5 experts will be presenting information on the redistricting process in Ohio. And there will be time, as Mario indicated, after the panel's presentation for you to ask questions. Also, if you have not already registered to vote or need to update your registration, if you moved or changed your name, if you'd like to complete the form, or if you'd like to complete a form to request an absentee ballot, there are League members available to help you with that on the table outside the venue here. We can also answer any questions you might have about voting if you need to at that table. Also, look for our voter's guide to elections in Greene and Montgomery counties. It'll be available about the time of early voting, which starts October 11th. You can find the voter's guide at local libraries, and you can also check it out on our website, which is lwvdayton.org. For more than 40 years, the League, for 40 years now, we are known for persistence, us women. It took us 80 years to get the vote after all. But for over 40 years, the League has been working on the fair districting process in Ohio. During that time, Ohio's congressional delegation went from 11 Republicans, 52% of the voters, and 10 Democrats, which were 48% of the voters, in the 1980s, to 12 Republicans, or 75% of the seats, and 4 Democrats, or 25% of the seats, after the 2010 census. Of course, with this malapportionment issue, it propelled even more energy and work to reform the redistricting process. The Republican Party over this time also achieved supermajorities of 6% or greater in both houses of the legislature, even though Republican candidates in statewide elections, 60%, I'm sorry, typically received only 54% of the votes to 46% for Democratic candidates. So members of our league worked hard in 2015 and 2018 to pass amendments to the Ohio Constitution intended to minimize gerrymandering, produce legislative and congressional districts that impartially represented Ohio voters, and after the 2020 census, would create competitive districts with outcomes that reflect the typical distribution of voters in statewide elections. However, a new analysis cited just this week by the Ohio Capital Journal has found that in the new districts, only 1 in 4 state house races will be competitive under the current redistricting plan. Our panel of experts is here tonight to help us understand our current situation and perhaps provide some indications of where we need to go from here. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dennis Turner. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Dayton School of Law. Dennis Turner was one of the original 5 faculty members who started the law school in 1974. He received his undergraduate and law degree from Georgetown University. He has taught many different courses, but most having to do with litigation. He has also been acting dean and director of the UD Law Clinic. He has just published a book, and if you're interested, you can talk to Dennis after the program. Dennis tonight has been asked to help the audience understand the terms redistricting and gerrymandering, and also to describe the citizen ballot initiatives of 2015 and 2018 to reform the redistricting process in Ohio. We are very fortunate to have Dennis with us this evening to share his wealth of expertise and information.
Thank you. Everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
I have a sergeant-like voice. So thank you for mentioning my book. I do have a few first editions left. And my wife would be very grateful if I could get some of those first editions out of our family room in our condo, which is not that large. So anyway, having said that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of gerrymandering, how it's accomplished, and then try to give you a basic idea of the Byzantine way the Ohio constitutional amendment was supposed to work. And it is if you've been in a maze, you know what it's like. But I will try to explain how it was meant to work, and then later on we'll hear how it didn't work. Now, we're all familiar with, or more of us familiar with, the process of voter suppression, and in which you have things to keep people from voting. Voter ID, roadblocks to registering, voter roll purges, all of those are designed to keep the voters from voting. But when it comes to gerrymandering, I think of gerrymandering as suppression by stealth. It gives you the impression that you're voting and gives you the impression that your vote will count. But in reality, you might just as well, because of gerrymandering, you might have just as well take your ballot and throw it in the trash. That's how much worth it's going to be in gerrymandered districts. It's not going to make a difference in the outcome at all. So it is a type of voter suppression by stealth. Every 10 years, as you know, we have a census, and the census is designed to give a snapshot of the population a whole lot of other things, the distribution of the population and how it's changed and how people have moved. So as you might expect, when people move, some states go bigger and gain population, others lose population, or they just move around. The districts that would be designed for representatives would have to change, because otherwise you end up with empty boroughs. That used to be the thing in England, where you'd have a few voters and they get an MP, and London would get one MP, and some little burg out in the Shire gets an MP too. So the census is supposed to allow the redistricting to reflect the reality of the population shift. So the census drives that. When you have the census, you have to have redistricting. That they follow, and the census is every 10 years. So this gentleman is Eldridge Geary, a pretty sinister looking guy, but he became famous for a different reason than you might expect. He actually signed the Declaration of Independence. He also was in the Constitutional Convention, but refused to sign off on the Constitution because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. He actually ultimately became a vice president, but the time that he was governor is the time we're talking about. He was governor in Massachusetts, and his party at that time had the governorship and the legislature in Massachusetts. So the idea was, well, how do we guarantee or help our candidates get reelected? What can we do about the districts that are designed to help our candidates to get reelected? So, this is Essex County, and you can see the towns, and you can see how whatever that creature is sort of bends around and incorporates little parts of different towns. And that enabled the representative, the senator for that district, to have a majority of their party's voters. It was manipulated so that it was packed more with in this case, the Democrats' party faithful. And some wisecracking journalist said it looked like a salamander. And then somebody tied the governor, who was in charge at this time, and put their name to it and said it's more of a gerrymandering. And that's how Eldridge Geary got his name on this process. It should be pronounced gerrymandering, but we pronounce it gerrymandering. So that's one of his claim to fame. I don't think anybody remembered him as a vice president. He actually died in office as vice president, but he lives on with the gerrymandering name. Now, when gerrymandering was first being used, and it was used by everybody, every party who was in power in a state would use a manipulation of the districts if they could work them to their advantage. It was done. But it was sort of a guessing game, because you sort of had to guess which precincts to move around and who had more voters than the other ones, and it was sort of a guessing. And sometimes you guessed wrong, and you weren't able to really influence the election the same way you'd hope. But as we got to the computers and the accuracy of the data that was going into the process, we are now able to manipulate a district down to the neighborhood. In fact, it is so sophisticated, they could draw a district and cut out your neighbor and over your back fence and put you in the district if they thought it would help. I mean, they can be that precise about it. So that made gerrymandering a much more powerful tool, because they now could manipulate districts down to a few people, and therefore guarantee the results of redistricting. So one of the mechanisms, the main mechanisms for gerrymandering. In the first slide, you see there's 4 squares. And each of these squares has an equal number of 8. 8 blues and 8 reds, representing parties. And so if there were elections held in those districts, the results would likely range all over the block. You could have 4 reds and 4 blue, or 4 blues, or no, 2 and 2. You have a possibility, and because they're so close in numbers, from one election to another, you could have a change of party in those districts. Incumbents don't like that. If you're elected in a district, you don't like to not be reelected. So how do we assure that we incumbents get reelected? One of the techniques is in the second image called packing. And you will note in that is what they have done is they have packed all the red folks, the red voters, into one district. By packing them into one district, that means the blue voters have a substantial majority of votes in the other 3 districts. You are guaranteed under this scenario, pretty much, that you're going to have 3 blues elected and 1 red out of those 4 districts. And it will go on forever. I mean, you're never going to get a change. The other technique that is often used is called cracking. And what they do is they crack the things and split off the voters various ways to again give a substantial majority of one kind of voter in a district, so that party will have to prevail. So in this case, you see how they've split up, split up the blue folks so that the red is dominant in 3 districts. Again, an election in this scenario is meaningless. The incumbent is going to get reelected. I mean, so your vote doesn't mean a whole lot often in those situations. So these, just for fun, these are the Ohio, couple of Ohio congressional districts that existed under the 2010 redistricting. I like to call the one I don't call it, other people call it, called the snake on the lake. You can't see it, but it starts up in a little piece of Toledo, winds its way around the lake, misses a lot of other things, incorporates other things, and finally gets into the western side of Cleveland. It's sort of like a snake. The other one is a little harder to see. When I've got an arrow there, I call this one the woodpecker. That's Representative Jordan's district. And you can see how it maneuvers around, avoiding Democratic voters and making sure that Jordan gets reelected. A good example of cracking, creative cracking, was the Ohio 1st Congressional District in Cincinnati. You notice how Hamilton County and the city of Cincinnati is divided. The people of Cincinnati are either put with the rest of Hamilton, and you have a little umbilical cord running up to Warren County, and then just to make sure about the balance, you got a little bit of an appendix coming down from Warren County to pick up a few more Republican voters, and so that makes a Republican district. And the same thing for the other half of Cincinnati. You see they've got a part coming in, and then that connects with Claremont, Brown, and Highland County. So again, it's an assured Republican district. There's no way a Democrat could be elected in either one of those districts. So, what is the consequences of gerrymandering? What are some of the consequences of gerrymandering? It polarizes politics. So this example tries to capture, like, here we have a person who would been elected like to be re-elected. And if this were, and the question is, how moderate do you think this candidate's view would be? Under this scenario, we have 50% of the voters on one side of the spectrum and 50% of the voters on the other side of the spectrum. So how moderate do you think that candidate will be? Pretty moderate, right? They need voters from the other side of the aisle, or at least independents on the other side of the aisle in order to get elected. What gerrymandering does, however, is it chops off a certain percentage of those voters on one side of the spectrum. Now, if this individual wants to get reelected, what is this person, how moderate do you think they're going to be? Not so moderate, because they know if they get to the general election, they will win. But they got to get to the general election first, which means the fringe group of their party has a lot of control of whether they get the nomination or not. And if they don't move to the fringier side of the party, they're not going to get the nomination, and then they won't be elected because they won't get the nomination. So it polarizes people's views, the gerrymandering situation. The other thing is, we operate under the impression that democracy equals the will of the people. But with regard to gerrymandering, it's something else. So I won't go through this detail. I'll just give you an example here. So let's say, and I think this reflects somewhat the Ohio view, let's say 60% of the voters in Ohio would probably like some kind of regulation of farm runoff, approximately 60%. So, and say 40% don't care about farm runoff, so you'd have that kind of division. In the Senate, the state Senate, here's the group that would be opposed to regulation, and then this group would be in favor of regulation. So in that situation, in a democracy, what is supposed to happen? You'll say, we are the majority, let's vote those legislators who are opposing the will of the party. Vote them out, get new ones in there, and let them do what we want. So you have a vote. In the gerrymandered state, introducing the new Senate, it's the same people. It's the same people that were there. So how much does that say about democracy and that? So proposed reforms. In general, the reforms have two main branches. One is get the politicians out of the process of redistricting. Get them out, because their self-interest is to get reelected. So if they got to get them out of the system. Others, plus you might have mandatory guidelines for redistricting. In other words, when you redraw the districts, you've got certain criteria you have to abide by. Those are the two main approaches for dealing with gerrymandering. So what did Ohio do? This is the Ohio approaches. You notice this is the commission. Are there any non-politicians in that group? No. They are all politicians. There's the governor, the auditor, the secretary of state, speaker of the House, president of the Senate, House minority leader, and Senate minority leader. They're all politicians that are supposed to come up with these new districts. So they're supposed to, these 7 individuals are supposed to adopt a map by September 1st after a number of public hearings. So, and there was mandatory guidelines, I won't go through all of them, but a major mandatory guideline that was mentioned previously is the statewide proportional share of legislative seats should correspond closely to statewide state and federal partisan elections, the results over the last 10 years. Meaning, if the statewide broke down 54% Republican, 46% Democrat, the representatives and the senators ought to come out at about the same kind of proportion under the redistricting. So that was a mandatory guideline to do that. Now, if the plan is approved by 4-3, it can be approved by 4-3, if the two minority representatives, the two minority politicians agree with two of the majority to a map, then it's enacted. If that happens, no, that's a little pie in the sky stuff, but if it happens, then what you now have a map for 10 years. You have, the districts are drawn for 10 years, and the legislature can't fiddle with the districts after that. If you get two of one party, and you have to have there's only two minority members of the commission agree, you get maps that would be good for 10 years. So, if you can't get that, you go back to the drawing board, and the proposed map must be adopted by September 5th by at least a 4-3 majority of the commission. So now, however, you don't need two minority members getting on board. You still need a 4-3 vote, but you don't need the two minority members agreeing to it, and you can pass it. What's the downside of that from those who are passing this? Well, the downside is the results are only good for 4 years. You don't get a 10-year map. Now, I guess the thinking was, along the line here, that would be a disincentive for people to enact gerrymandered maps. It would be a disincentive because the thought would be, hey, you gerrymandered now, but in 4 years, the other party might be in power, and they're going to do the same thing, so you should want a nice fair map for 10 years. That's what you shoot for. And so that's the risk and the threat, I guess, of sorts. So otherwise you have to repeat the process again after 4 years. So 4 years later, if it's a 4-year plan, you're back to the commission, and now they got to try to enact, pull out new districts again. Same group, though, in the commission. But the results, if the politicians are the same, the results probably going to be the same in 4 years. The redrawing of districts for congressional representatives is a little different. There are mandatory guidelines. Again, the major mandatory guidelines is that the statewide proportional share of legislative seats should correspond to the statewide, state, and federal partisan election results during the last 10 years. So a proportional kind of representation. Now the procedural requirements, okay, you want to imagine this one. Imagine this one. If at least 60%, that takes at least 60% of the House and Senate to approve the map. Of that 60%, at least 50% of the minority party votes in favor of the redrawn maps. So you have 100 House members. You have 60 Republicans and 40 Democrats. To pass it, you need 60 votes. And at least 20 of those votes must be Democrats. And if they can do that, they get a map for 10 years. And these are for the congressional representatives. That's, you get your 10-year map if you get that kind of agreement. Well, not surprisingly, if you don't get that kind of agreement, what happens? It goes back to the commission. And it says to the commission, you got to try to come up with this map. And you need those two minority people to agree, and we get a 10-year map. If you can't do it, you can't get that agreement, what happens? It goes back to the legislature, right? So, if they can't agree, it's back to the legislature, and they've got a timeline to adopt it. I won't talk too much about that. Now the procedure requirements are different. At least 60% of the House and Senate still have to approve the map. At least a third of the minority party has to vote in favor of the redrawn maps. So if you have 100 House members, 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats, to pass you need 60 more of the total. At least 14 of those voters must be Democrats, and then the map duration is 10 years. You get 10 years if you can get that kind of agreement. Didn't happen. Option 4, if that doesn't happen, now the legislature can go back and approve a redistricting map by a simple majority vote of the parties. Doesn't make any, you can have nobody who's the minority party vote on this. All you need is more than 50% to vote to put that map in, and then that lasts for 4 years, and that's got the 4-year limitation. So, finally, if that's done, in 4 years, you've got to go through the whole process again. So, now there's also judicial review of these decisions by the Ohio Supreme Court. If mandatory guidelines are not followed, the Supreme Court can send them back. And others will address the issue of what does that mean when the Supreme Court sends it back, when the folks you send it back to sort of give you, some kind of obscene sign to the Supreme Court. So, but in theory, the Supreme Court reviews it and decides, no, you're not following the mandatory guidelines, it's unconstitutional. So, this is a hobby horse of mine, I suppose, so you're going to be subjected to it. It's that, the underlying assumption, I think, for a viable democracy is good faith and the rule of law. In other words, that the people who are trying to enact these reforms, are trying to accomplish the job, are doing so in good faith. They're really trying to solve the problem in a fair way. And they obey the rule of law naturally. In other words, you pay your taxes without somebody standing over your head with the whip. You do a lot of things because you believe in the rule of law. You don't operate outside the rule of law. Democracy depends on that, because otherwise you need a police state. And police states don't work too well because it really fosters corruption on all kinds of levels. And I had an experience in that way in St. Petersburg when we were visiting St. Petersburg with a group. One of the members of the party went and walked on this grass. Well, our tour guide went nuts. No, don't walk on the grass. What do you mean don't walk on the grass? Because there's going to be a policeman that will come up and say, you walked on the grass. You're going to be arrested unless you pay me something. And that's what you get with a corrupt system when there's no really rule of law. So finally, I want to tell you, again, I am not a believer in a silver bullet, generally. That a silver bullet with one solution will solve a lot of problems. But when it comes to gerrymandering, I believe if you can kill the gerrymandering werewolf with a silver bullet, it would make a tremendous difference. It would make a huge difference in our society if you can do that. So let's hope we can do it. So thank you very much.
Sounds like a plan. Why don't I join you, and that way we can do it quickly. Stand by for technical changes.
I don't know what I'm going to do with this time.
I think we can just
Set it.
Before Catherine starts, I will introduce her. Our next speaker is Catherine Turcer. We're just so pleased to have her. She's Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio. She has coordinated the Fair Districts Fair Election Coalition. She's been there from the beginning, all through the trials and tribulations. This coalition was initially organized to pass the successful state legislative redistricting reform ballot measure in 2015 and worked with many others to successfully pass congressional redistricting reform in 2018. In 2021, Catherine was the director of Ohio Citizens Action Money and Politics Project for 15 years. In 2006, Catherine received the Spirit of Democracy Award from the Ohio Secretary of State. Catherine's going to provide a description of how the reform process that Dennis was describing was or was not implemented with the various legislative efforts, redistricting commission, community sessions, and meetings to approve maps, and the resultant court cases at the Ohio Supreme Court.
Hi, everybody. How are y'all today? All right, you can hear me. Okay, so how many of you participated in public hearings? You actually went to those public hearings and you testified. All right, put your hands up. How many of you made community maps or attended sessions where you thought about, well, what is it that we want to do with those district lines? So raise your hand. Okay, so one of the things that I think is incredibly important here is the story of people like you and many of you in this room who have come together to make democracy better. And the problem is that this is kind of a tale of woe, right? So what I'm going to do is talk to you about what happened and a little bit about where we're going to go from here. But I think what's really important is the story of this is the story of the power of the people, some real structural problems when it comes to our democracy. And I want us all to look at all the people that are in this room. I don't know about you, it's a gorgeous day out there. It's that last little bit of summer. We could be having, I don't know, a beer on a patio. And yet, here we are coming together to talk about democracy. Because the work of democracy is ongoing. It's the work of a lifetime. I believe in the power and promise of democracy. I also believe it's not working. And we all need to be here together to work on it. And I wanted to start this conversation with you all, really highlighting what it was like when we got to December of 2014. You know, if you go back to 2015, we had a citizen initiative, a redistricting citizen initiative that was an independent commission with some good rules, and boy did we get our butts kicked. Millions of dollars were spent against Voters First. And I don't know if you remember the ballot language of 2012. It was longer than my arm. And it was just incredibly painful. They kept talking about unaccountable bureaucrats, faceless bureaucrats with unlimited money. So much money will be spent on redistricting because we have this Citizens Commission. There were flyers saying that we were against family values. There were flyers that said that we were just disgruntled Democrats. So as we think about, well, how is it we got a reform that was a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it was a compromise, the compromise, you know, that the professor worked through. Like, you're like, well, wait a second, why did we think all of these rules would work together? And the reason that we thought the rules would work together is there was a focus on keeping communities together, or political subdivisions together, so county, city, township. There were rules about transparency. There was a rule prohibiting gerrymandering or drawing district lines that favor one political party over the other. We know that the manipulation of district lines is the manipulation of elections, and the manipulation of elections is the manipulation of public policy. And we know that we don't go to vote just because we want to vote, right? Like, we don't go there because, you know, it's just an activity. We go there because we want our voice to count. And so when Republicans came to the table, keep in mind supermajority in both chambers, and said, yes, we're ready to put some good rules in the Ohio Constitution that focus on transparency, keeping communities together, and an anti-gerrymandering provision. That seemed wonderful. Now, you know, it's a little awkward and a little weird, but so important. Also, it included a metric called representational fairness, where you look at the 10 years and you have a metric for measuring how disproportionate or how gerrymandered things are. So you look at 10 years, you know, governor, auditor, secretary of state, you look at, you know, the president and US senator, and you can see, oh, let's average them all out, put them all together, average them all out, and you can see that we should have, you know, 54% of those districts should favor Republicans, 46% should favor Democrats. And we went into this map making with a really decent metric, meaning there were the tools that the elected officials needed so they could have actually drawn fair districts. They chose not to. And so I wanted to include this picture here. I don't know how many of you know Ellis Jacobs from Able, but I just wanted to be very clear. When the reform measure was passed in the Ohio House, this was the last day that Bill Batchelder was Speaker, we were up in the balcony and we were so excited we actually started clapping. And Dayton was represented by Ellis here. And we were just so pleased, and we had this vision that if we could get the voters to approve this, that the rules of map making could in fact change the quality of democracy, right? That was the hope in 2015. This is December of 2015. And yet, what we know is they only wanted to do state legislative. All right, how many in here collected signatures so we could try to do a citizen initiative in 2017? We were like, okay, we're going to collect signatures. Everybody's hand up that did that. Because, of course, they weren't going to do anything about Congress unless we actually, you know, put a little fire in their belly. And we did that with 250,000 valid signatures from Ohio. Like, think about that again. We did that. It's important to realize that all of these reforms were approved by voters, and they came because voters demanded they do better. Even though we're not talking about an even number of Democrats and Republicans making this decision, we were talking about a supermajority of Republicans. And so these rules were a compromise, but they seemed like the best deal that we were going to get. And why in the world would you put something in the Ohio Constitution and not actually follow the rules? You know, we get kind of irritated if somebody didn't follow the rules when they were playing bridge, right? We would get super irritated, I don't know, if somebody cut us off in traffic. We would get super irritated if all of a sudden the person next to you decided they were going to sit in your lap, right? Well, not you, sir, you'll probably be happy. But the point is, there are all sorts of rules that are just kind of generally agreed, and then there are laws, and then there are things that are in the Ohio Constitution. Everything, when you think of rule of law, it's built on the Constitution, whether it's the US or the Ohio Constitution. And yet, so I thought that this political cartoon really painted a picture. Oh, by the way, I'm so in love with the notion that you can watch her and not watch me. How cool is that? All right, well, I just wanted to highlight that Ohioans came out and really promoted the need for a transparent redistricting process. They highlighted how painful it was to participate in elections that were not meaningful. And I want to remind you all that the census was delayed. And because the census was delayed, in April of 2021, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, and others called on the legislature to move the 2022 primary. Meaning, April of 2021, we're saying, okay, we're not sure we're going to be able to get the map making done in time. Let's be honest about that, and let's move that primary in 2022. Well, we all know we participated in 2 primaries. I just want to highlight how smart the League is. And also how obvious the problem was, right? It was obvious from the get-go. There was no confusion that we were likely to end up with 2 primaries or have all sorts of confusion. And so I just want to highlight how important it was that people came, people testified, people participated, and how much it hurts to know that we put the rules in the Ohio Constitution and they completely disregarded them. And so I first wanted to start with the state legislative maps. State legislative maps, this is the Ohio House and Ohio Senate, were found to be unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. We voted in August on unconstitutional maps. What happened is a federal panel stepped in and said, hey, you're not getting it together, we're just going to use this 3rd set of maps. Meaning there was no need or there was no sense that, oh, okay, let's go ahead and create better maps. They had the opportunity in both the 4th and 5th set, right? They didn't take it. So this is very challenging, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, because why is it that the state legislature believed that they could completely disregard the Ohio Constitution, the Ohio voters, and the Ohio Supreme Court?
The May maps were unconstitutional as well.
Keep going, Ken.
Yeah, and he's highlighting one of the things I think that's super important when we say that they're unconstitutional. They were found to be unconstitutional because they were favoring one political party over the other, that they were in fact partisan gerrymanders. And so I just wanted to highlight the district lines that we're voting under, and you can actually go up and look at kind of local districts at the end of this to kind of think about, well, what kind of shenanigans did they get up to in your county? What kind of things were they doing so that they could divide counties? How are they packing? How are they cracking? And I would encourage us all to look at those district lines. What is incredibly important is what they did initially is they just favored Republicans 80% of the time. 80%, when the partisan index was 54-46. Then they said, okay, well, we're going to switch it just so it's not quite as bad. And then they said, well, you know what we should do? They made them so that the disparity is because of the number of competitive districts, right? Because they're like, people like competitive districts, but the only competitive districts are Democratic districts. And so I can't tell you what's going to happen next, because the Ohio Redistricting Commission essentially refused to reconvene, and they haven't drawn the district lines for 2024. I don't know what will happen. I don't know what will happen. But what we do know is that I'm talking about a slow motion constitutional crisis, right? When one branch of government acts as if the other branch of government does not matter. They aren't just disrespecting the Ohio Supreme Court, they are disrespecting us. Now, I also wanted to highlight what happened with the congressional maps. Okay, they have been found to be unconstitutional twice. And most recently, in July, the deadline for drawing congressional maps was Friday. The Ohio Redistricting Commission did not reconvene. Speaker Cupp said, well, it's just a bunch of out-of-state activists. Can you think of anything more ludicrous? And then you have Senate President Huffman, who was like, well, I don't know, what we really should do is we should actually take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, because the Ohio Supreme Court stepped beyond their boundaries. Now, I want to be super clear. Huffman, Senate President Huffman, was one of the sponsors of the legislation that got the reforms on the ballot. Okay. Generally, when you create the rules, you follow the rules because you have buy-in, right? You have buy-in, you're ready to do what those rules are. The other thing that I think is important is he really, when I go back to 2014, he really did not want to have the federal court step in. He considered them too liberal, and they were all about voting rights, and what he wanted was the Ohio Supreme Court. Now remember, the makeup of the Ohio Supreme Court has changed over the years, and so it is much more balanced. And let's face it, when it comes to assessing whether something meets the Constitution, you can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, you just have to analyze what's in the Ohio Constitution, which is why it was a bipartisan group of justices that said no. And not just once, not just twice, 7 times. Now, I wanted to highlight Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor. This is something that she said in January of this year. She essentially said, maybe we should be thinking about taking the car keys away from these map makers. Okay, so the argument is super drunk on power, because right, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about retaining power. We're talking about manipulating elections for our party. Well, what do you do with drunks? You take away their keys. We take away their keys, meaning that we need to put the map making in the hands of citizens. And so there are states that have done this. You can look at California, you can look at our neighbor Michigan, Arizona, long time, multiple decades of having citizens make the maps. There are options out there, and we should consider them, and we have the ability to do a citizen initiative. So she's saying, hey, this is just the first time that she looked at these maps. Now, I wanted to highlight, for Congress, same kind of deal. Any of the competitive seats are Democratic seats, right? So it's that idea, there are 4 seats. 3 of them are super competitive. Okay, so you know what? If you have a ton of money, or you have the likelihood of ton of dark money, well, it's pretty easy to get things to come out in your favor, right? So the competitive districts become really problematic. And so kind of the close one, the one that you could say, okay, Marcy Kaptur is the incumbent in, and I don't have the district, I should be looking at this. We'll do one. We'll do the Shabbat district, Old Shabbat district, number 1. That's a good example of a really competitive district that it could go really either way. We could actually send more people to DC to represent us this decade than we did the last decade before we had rules telling them they couldn't gerrymander. Now think about the cognitive dissonance. If we don't follow the law, we go to jail. Then we go to prison. We have to worry about things like bail. And yet, the Ohio Supreme Court said, hey, you do better. But what they didn't do is not just give the, hey, do better, here's a carrot, come on, do better. They didn't give them the stick, right? They did not hold them in contempt. They did not give them fines. They did not put them in jail. They did not say, hey, we're going to sequester you for a week, and you are going to come up with fair maps. I mean, any of us could come up with some common sense solutions that the Ohio Supreme Court did not take. And yet, really, courts all the time just tell us what to do. And we just do it, right? We just do it. So last week, the Chief Justice, who is retiring, said, hey, you know what I'm going to do when I retire? I am going to work on redistricting reform. And I believe we should have an independent citizen commission. So an insulated commission where you could mitigate, you wouldn't have elected officials in the driver's seat, but you also could mitigate all of the partisan interests. And, I think it's exciting to imagine, coming together, as we remember, this is a Chief Justice who is a Republican, who served as lieutenant governor under Governor Taft. So this is an opportunity because, one of the challenges is that people think that if you're talking about reform in this state, because the villains when it comes to gerrymander are Republicans, that suggests that you're just a bunch of Democrats, right? No, we want meaningful elections, and we know that Republicans and Democrats supported the 2015 and the 2018 reforms, and we need everybody at the table, independents. Now, you know who we don't need at the table? Folks who do not believe that democracy should work. We are here because we want a functional democracy. Now, I did want to highlight this tool. We have this new tool, and I'm going to stop here because I know other people are dying to talk and tell you more. But there is so much more I could tell you about, and I did want to highlight, and it's not going very well. Sorry, everybody. I will encourage you all to go to this. It's bit, so it's bit.ly/2021 maps timeline. And what you can do there is you can read all of the legal briefs. You can check out all of the different ways that folks took action. We had a redistricting competition. There was a citizens commission where they came together and citizens basically modeled what a citizens commission could be. There were model maps that were proposed. There was lots of testimony. I don't know about you, but I rallied at the State House a number of times. We made a lot of noise, and oh my gosh, the pictures are great, and I really encourage all of us to take a look at that if you're at all interested in taking a deep dive into all the nerdy details and all the legal briefs. And with that, I thank you so much, and I will hand it off to the next person.
Thank you, Catherine. She was there in all those battles that waged over months. Tom Roberts is our next presenter, and he's the president of the Ohio State Conference, NAACP. He was elected in September of 2017 and is currently in his third term, innovating and recharging units across the state of Ohio. Roberts has a long dedicated history and leadership to the NAACP. In 2016, Roberts was elected second vice president of the conference and served in this role while simultaneously serving his appointment as the political action chairman for Dayton unit of the NAACP. President Roberts is a dedicated public servant as demonstrated by his service in both Ohio House and Ohio Senate, where he represented the people of the Miami Valley for over 20 years. President Roberts is a 25-year employee of Sinclair Community College, where he serves as advisor to the Sinclair, Ohio Fellow Student Leadership Development Program. The program helps students understand the concept of servant leadership. In 2015, Roberts completed a 6-year appointment as commissioner to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. Additionally, Governor Kasich appointed President Roberts to the Ohio Collaborative Community Police Advisory Board. A featured keynote and public speaker, President Roberts helps to inspire youth, transformational leaders, communities, and organizations across the nation. President Roberts is a graduate of the University of Dayton with a bachelor's degree in communication arts and Chaminade High School. He's a lifelong resident of Montgomery County. Tom has been asked to provide a description of his experience as a member of the Citizens Redistricting Commission and what insight he has to offer about his experience. Please welcome Tom.
Well, thank you, Diane. You know, when you have all these experts, what can I say, right? I rewrote my presentation 4 times now. This young lady next to me, when someone used the word, Professor Turner used the word gerrymander, she did like this. You know? So that's an appropriate sign for what's going on in the legislature, and you should be as outraged as Catherine is. Catherine and I have been working together over the last 20 years. But you were represented at the state level in 2015. Your director of the League of Women Voters was there, along with Common Clause. NAACP, Ohio Voices, when, as legislators, the deal was cut, and how we were going to do the drawing of the legislation and the ballot initiative. And my mother is 99 years old, and I heard her use a term on the phone one time: you have the audacity and the mitigated gall. Well, that's what this legislature has done. They've had the audacity and the unmitigated gall to thumb their nose at the Ohio Supreme Court. Professor Turner, I was going to use another term like arrogance or unethical, immoral, but I'll stick with a safe term like good faith and rule of law. Because as we wrap up constitutional celebration, which was last week, and this Saturday, we have to remember what the rule of law means in our society, what it really means. And I go back to what Ben Franklin was asked when he left the Constitution, and someone said, Dr. Franklin, what do we have? And he said, a republic if we know how to keep it. That's what we're faced with right now, a republic if we know how to keep it. Yes, NAACP is the oldest, boldest, baddest civil rights organization in the country. We're nonpartisan, but we want fairness and justice. And what I'm seeing going on in Columbus and in Washington is polarizing, is uneasy. And I was a benefactor of somewhat of gerrymandering, but that was to get a black, a more representational General Assembly. But what's going on right now? Why do you need a supermajority? It makes no sense. Speaker Davidson, when I was there, she was able to go across the aisle to get some votes if she needed it. She had what we called, what was that group called? It'll come to me. But they were the ultra-conservative members. Caveman caucus. Now they love that term. They loved it because they were very conservative, ultra-conservative, but the Caveman caucus held their weight, and Speaker Davidson came across the aisle and asked for support to pass legislation. That's what the legislative process is all about. You don't need a supermajority. And so I wanted to just say those things because I was a part of A. Philip Randolph Institute, the NAACP, and the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. Now, using what Catherine talked about and Dennis talked about, the 54-46 population, because you talk about statewide elections, we saw that 54% of the time Republicans won, 46% of the time Democrats won. So that was what we used. And so APRI, NAACP, and the Organizing Collaborative put together a Citizens Commission on Redistricting. And we each looked out and asked people to be on this commission, to be a part of this commission. We held statewide hearings. I think we heard from over 400 and some individuals. It was all virtual. But we heard what people had to say, and we drew fair maps. We had Richard Gunther, who was probably one of the most renowned people in the country on redistricting and drawing these maps, and we drew fair maps. I asked Catherine before coming in, I don't think the commission even bothered to pay attention to them. But we drew a fair map, and that was to show if the commission would have done what we did and gone out and got public testimony, heard from the public, they could have drawn fair maps. But I think, hindsight tells me, that there were some people who negotiated in bad faith, who knew the outcome because they knew in their mind what was going on in other places. And I tell you, what's scary to me right now is what's called the independent legislature. And that's what the U.S. Supreme Court is going to take up. And what that is basically saying is that only the legislature can draw maps and remove the courts altogether. And I believe, my hindsight tells me, some people knew that going into this conversation. Knew that. And as Dennis said, didn't negotiate in good faith. We had public hearings. 494 Ohio citizens testified. We issued a report, if you want to see it. what the testimony was like. We have a website. But one of the things I think we need to be perfectly clear, and I'll end with this because I think when you get too many experts, we're going to repeat ourselves. But I wanted to go outside the box and just share with you things that I thought were relevant. And the independent legislature, and the other thing that I think is going to be critical as we go forward is a federal ruling that basically said no private right of action under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which simply means only the U.S. Attorney can file these lawsuits, and no individual or organizations like the League of Women Voters, like APRI, like NAACP, like Common Cause can file these lawsuits. I think you ought to be outraged. You ought to be simply outraged. In November, you ought to exercise what Ben Franklin talked about, and make sure that this legislative process, this public involvement, because one of the greatest aspects of a democracy is your right to vote. And when they take away from you that right to make a choice, the people of Trotwood, I'm sure they're outraged because their district is so divided up that I don't even know if they know who they're voting for at this time. So I would only ask you to look forward to our conversation, but I would go back to my 99-year-old mother and say, they have the audacity and a mitigated goal to do what they did. You need to be upset. And if someone in the movie said, you need to be mad as hell. Thank you very much.
And that's from the heart about Tom's experience working on this issue. Myla Cardona-Jones is Assistant Professor and Project Coordinator in the Law and Public Safety Department at Sinclair College. She serves on the Prison Reform Committee for the League of Women Voters that is researching and conducting interviews to publish recommendations to the state of Ohio in an effort to objectively address any inequities in our prison systems. Her research is mainly focused on the correlation between education and recidivism. Myla has made presentations on a number of topics, including race, bias, equity, ethics, redlining, gerrymandering, and understanding your rights. She is currently teaching a free course open to the community entitled Race and the Law. I've taken this course twice. It's so good. I really encourage you to attend it. And Myla has been asked to describe tonight how gerrymandering has impacted marginalized groups, especially African American voters, and what the recent actions of the Redistricting Commission may mean for the Black community. Please welcome Myla.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm going to take this off. I'm not used to standing at the podium, so I need a little movement. First, thank you to the League of Women Voters for the opportunity to speak today. This is something that I'm definitely very passionate about, and as all the experts have already conveyed, it is a very serious topic and discussion, and so it's really great to see such a wonderful turnout on a Tuesday evening to have this really, really important conversation. I did share an image for everyone. I'm not sure if, I only printed 60 and I think we're above that, but for anyone who did receive it, I'm going to kind of walk through those images now, and so we'll kind of follow along as we have this conversation. So the first thing that I really wanted to touch on, and it's been mentioned, but I'm going to speak to it from a couple of different lenses, is the constitutionality of this piece. That playing into what leads to a lot of these inequities. So first and foremost, when we think about the opinions that were rendered and how many times this goes up to the Ohio Supreme Court and gets overturned, that should not be left upon us, right? The fact that the Ohio Supreme Court is telling individuals what needs to be done in order for it to be deemed constitutional, and they make slight variations or slight changes and then send it back on through. I find that to be very fascinating. And this particular language from the opinion that was rendered for the third time that it was denied is important. So under paragraph 100, I'm going to read, that perhaps explains how a party that generally musters no more than 55% of the statewide popular vote is positioned to reliably win anywhere from 75% to 80% of the seats in the Ohio congressional delegation. By any rational measure, that skewed result just does not add up. And that language is really important and powerful. They spoke a little bit more in the opinion, and they addressed that that would give 10 safe Republican seats versus 5 Democratic Republican seats. And due to all of the experts that were involved, and the fact that the Democratic Party did file a complaint, but they provided a significant amount of evidence, they suggested that it really should have looked more like 6 Democratic safe seats and 9 Republican safe seats. So let's make those adjustments to see that through. Now, we're going to shift over to the right, and we're going to look at the 2 parties. And the reason that's important is because right now we're in a significant political divide. We've already heard that from some of the experts that have discussed this, and if you're paying attention, as I imagine everyone in this room is, we know that to be true. So we've already talked about the fact that the Ohio Commission, the Redistricting Commission, was 5-2 on every single voting. And that was by party line, right? So 5-2 every time. And that's important to remember because that's people remaining loyal to their party, not to the process, even though the whole purpose was to be bipartisan. It's also important to note that there's a glimmer of hope, because we wouldn't be here having this conversation if Justice O'Connor hadn't broken party line. So I do think it's important to highlight that it can happen. It takes one person to step outside of those party lines to recognize that there is an injustice and we need to address it. So it's really great, and she's not only just broken party lines, she's now gone on record multiple times stating that she does not agree with the way in which these maps have been drawn, and we have to do better. So let's talk about what that looks like when we don't break party line and we're only interested in our individual party, in the interest, right? So this is an example for the Senate. Thinking about how Dayton is now redistricted, right? How we are now a part of Senator Antoni's district, okay? So he was elected in 2018. And since he's elected in 2018, we will leverage those maps in 2022, but many people in Dayton will not have the ability to vote then, right? Because he won't be up for election. We also know that those maps have to be redrawn for 2024. So when we think about that redrawing of those maps, the thing that I challenge everyone to do is to pay attention to how Dayton shifts. Where are the majority of the citizens of Dayton placed when those maps are redrawn? And if we ultimately go back to Huffman or some other district where there is no one voting, that means that we go a significant number of years without having the right to vote. So that drops right down to that next image. Our voting is denied for several important elections. And it's so important to think about that, because if that happens, that needs to be a part of the complaint that is made. The way in which they continue to shift people and deny them of the right and the access to vote for really, really important matters, such as that. Also, I have to talk about gerrymandering from this perspective of prisoners. I teach in our prison systems, and I see it firsthand. If you think about, if you teach in Dayton Correctional, you have a certain demographic representation of individuals, and most of them, if they're Dayton Correctional, are going to be at a prison that would likely represent their interests if they were outside, okay? Because based off of how we vote and how those individuals who are incarcerated would vote. When those individuals are moved out to Warren County Correctional or Lebanon, it shifts. Because likely they would not vote in the same way that they are then being represented in those counties. Now there are some states that actually do not count prisoners as their representatives. There are some states that do that. We have not done a very good job of that historically. And so when we think about that representation, that shift in what it does, it creates more power and opportunity to certain populations that wouldn't otherwise have it, simply because of the placement of these institutions. And if we think about the fact that this is for 10 years, most people's prison times are less than that. So they are being added into a bucket of representation that will not benefit them once they come out in 2 years or 5 years. And they're locked out of the opportunities in some instances to vote even further. So going back to this whole vote denied piece is important because we also want to talk about the money that's being spent and how much money has been spent thus far. And so I know that there's one statistic that for the August primary we paid over $25 million. And I think the overall turnout for that primary was 8%. 8%. There's a lot of money being exhausted, a lot of resources being exhausted, a lot of people sitting when they could be working on a lot of other initiatives to appease one particular party. And just so you know, I might be picking a little bit more on the Republican Party, but Democrats have done the same thing. So I'm very neutral when it comes to having the conversation about the fact that we've leveraged these maps in many ways to the advantage of whoever's in power and who has the political control. And so it really is important for that. Something that's also important when we think about this divide, and especially the political party divide, is that where does it leave our independent voters? So when you create these maps and you district people in these very intentional ways, it doesn't allow much opportunity for us to have anything but a two-party system because of the way in which resources are being positioned and shifted in a number of ways. And that creates challenges because we continue to have these divides and then there's no other opportunity. So the only solution, what has already been suggested and offered by many people, is if we remove the politics from the process. Because if we don't do that, then we can continue to be here every 4 years, every 10 years, having this conversation and be fired up and angry, but there will be nothing we can do if we do not make that very important shift. So those are my thoughts, and I look forward to having some continued discussion.
Some really great points Myla's making that we may not have thought about, especially having prisons located in rural areas to boost the rural population in terms of representation. I think that's a really interesting point. I just read an article about that recently. Our next presenter and last presenter, and then we'll have questions, and I'll discuss the process for questions as we get there. But our next presenter is Gary Leppla. He has practiced law in Dayton since 1978, and he's a board-certified civil trial lawyer. He served as president of the Ohio State Bar Association and as president of the Dayton Bar Association. Mr. Leppla has served for over a decade on the Ohio Equal Justice Foundation Board and serves on the executive committee of the NAACP Dayton unit. He briefly served as second vice president of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Mr. Leppla was a spokesperson for Voters First, speaking and debating throughout southwestern Ohio in support of State Issue 2, the Ohio Redistricting Amendment, which was on the ballot in 2012. The measure would have created a 12-person citizen commission to draw legislative and congressional district maps. The commission was designed to create districts that would reflect the state's geographic, racial, ethnic, and political diversity. The initiative would have also barred lobbyists and elected officials from joining the commission under the theory that voters should choose their elected officials as opposed to allowing elected officials to choose the voters. Gary will describe why he thinks the attempts at reform of the redistricting process in Ohio were not successful and what could be done to fix the process. He'll also describe the possible impacts of future political issues on redistricting, such as the independent state legislative doctrine. Please welcome Gary.
Thank you, fellow panelists. It's good to hear what you have had to say. And you said so much that is so important that we need to really focus on. I'm the last speaker. I'm supposed to run out the clock Not fumble, not allow an onside kick, not allow a long pass like my football team did Sunday. Anyway, it's nice to not be on Zoom and have a chance to talk.
Sir, we can't hear you. Can't hear you back there.
That's the first time
Hold
I've
the
been told that in
microphone.
my life. All right, is that better?
No, you have to hold the mic up close to your foot.
I'm right up on it.
There you go.
Okay. The most recent events, of course, the Supreme Court ruled that the gerrymandered districts violated the state constitution. The legislature had 30 days to do something about it. They did nothing. They took no action, including as led by a former Supreme Court Justice, Bob Cupp, as leadership of that party. Next, with that failure, goes back to the Ohio Redistricting Commission, which was supposed to take action by last Friday. Nothing happened. Somebody's already said thumbing the nose at the Ohio Constitution and voters. That's at least one of the digits they expressed as. Complete lack of respect for the rule of law. The courts could have fixed this decades ago. And the theory is, and Tom mentioned it, that this, what we like to think is a convoluted independent state legislature theory is something that the GOP is looking forward to since the Supreme Court has taken a case on that issue. I've been angry since 2012 about this. And Catherine knows, she mentioned it. At that time, the constitutional provision that was on the ballot would, as I think she said, someone said, had a 12-person citizen commission to draw the districts. You couldn't be honored if you're a lobbyist. You couldn't be honored if you were a legislator. You couldn't be honored if you were a family member of that, of a legislator. Both political parties opposed it. I guess as Democrats were thinking Vern Reif was going to rise up and lead a new effort at gerrymandering, but that didn't happen. The Ohio State Bar Association opposed it, which sticks in my craw and will for the rest of my life. The then president of that bar association now serves on the Ohio Supreme Court. He was an appellate justice at the time. And their excuse for opposing that was that appellate judges as a group were given a role in breaking deadlocks, and that was a problem with separation of powers. Of course, the Supreme Court's involved. We've got different branches involved, of course. One of the questions to me has been, why have true reform efforts failed? It's real simple. It's clear. And Justice O'Connor said it in her opinion. The political parties refuse to give up control. They insist on telling us who we have to vote for rather than letting us select candidates. There's been efforts there was a more recent effort to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot. Petitions were circulated, but then a deal was cut. And some of the people that felt that way said, well, that's the best we're going to do. Well, the best we're going to do is absolutely useless, as we've seen here in recent days. A lot of people said, no way, don't do that. So if this independent state legislature theory is the back door for the dominant party, how's that going to work? Well, there's two provisions, without digging deep into this in the short time we have, there's two provisions in the United States Constitution that make reference to the role of the legislature. One clause, the elections clause, says, manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. And a separate provision says each state shall appoint as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So at the time, there's originalists. We're not going to dig too deep, but those who say we enforce the Constitution as it was understood and drafted and existed ignore the fact that there were 6 states with constitutions then, and all of them had a legislature under the control of the Constitution of that state and subject to the courts. The concern, and we laughed when we first started about this. I laughed But I laughed when people said the Second Amendment could bar gun control efforts a couple decades ago. A lot of people thought that was ridiculous. So look out for this independent state legislature theory. The United States Supreme Court, at the end of its term in June, accepted a case for review, which will focus on that issue. North Carolina, the Supreme Court threw out their legislative maps, and in fact drew new maps. They have a fair elections clause in the North Carolina state constitution. And under that authority, the election went forward. Well, there was a challenge to that, an appeal, and there was an effort to try to stay that for this election, which did not make it through the Supreme Court. The state didn't, but the case was still accepted for review. And in fact, 3 members of that court are on record as supporting that doctrine: Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch. Imagine that. All 3 in favor of that. It's not clear how the Chief Justice feels. It's not clear how Kavanaugh feels, but he seems inclined towards it based upon other statements. And a lot of people are saying it's going to come right down to Amy Coney Barrett
Oh, great.
as to what happens on those on that legislative theory. So that would say, I don't care what your Constitution says, I don't care what your courts say, it's your legislature, our gerrymandered, grossly gerrymandered legislature that will call it, and it'll be night and day, totally in their hands. So why agree to anything the Ohio Supreme Court said if you believe, even if you help foster that legislation, or rather constitutional mandate, if you believe that maybe there's a way to take it all away from the court? And what's going to happen now? We have a contested race for Chief Justice. Both of those candidates are on the bench. They will stay on. But the one that wins will be replaced by the then governor. And there's 2 other challengers, one challenging the former president of the state bar from 2012, who are running against 2 incumbents, the other incumbent being the son of the governor. So what's going to happen? They're going to win. There's millions of dollars pouring into Ohio. Nobody's going to sneak up on the voters or the Republicans or anybody you disagree with anymore in this state because of what happened when Melody Stewart, through hard work and travel, was elected to the Supreme Court, something everybody's proud of. So what happens next? I think the Chief Justice nailed it. Well, one more thing about it, this independent legislature theory. There's a conference of Chief Justices in the United States. They're not political activists by any means, but in a rare move, all 50 Chief Justices in the United States joined together, urging that the court not accept that case about state legislature theory, and that the activity of the North Carolina Supreme Court be upheld when they drew maps under their state constitution. So there's a lot of fun ahead, a lot of reasons to be upset. It's not fun. And where we have Arizona, it's been mentioned, we have a Michigan system that's wonderful. There's no legislature involvement. In Ohio, we didn't get there. We have work to do. The Chief Justice said it in her opinion. She said the current redistricting process in Ohio is a failure. This is Ohio's Chief Justice. She said that the power to again amend the Ohio Constitution to ensure that partisan politics is removed from the drawing of districts is in the hands of the voter. Independent redistricting commissions like Michigan has, and like we wanted in 2012, became the premier institutional solution to the problem. Take it away from the legislature. She also said, now having seen firsthand that the current Ohio Redistricting Commission, composed of statewide elected officials and partisan legislators, is seemingly unwilling to put aside partisan concerns as directed by the people's vote. She says the citizens need to opt to amend the Constitution again. Hopefully not with the Ohio State Bar Association and 2 political parties opposing it. One certainly will. So look, I'm angry. We all ought to be angry. We all ought to let that anger drive us. And we got to get back to the time where as voters, we pick our representatives. They don't pick us.
Amen.
So thank you.
And now we'll have time for questions. Before we do though, Tom had a thought that he wanted to mention.
Yes, Catherine Dennis may rewrite my presentation so many times. I forgot to mention all politics is local. And I know this group knows that, but you know, we have courts, common pleas courts, judges, county commissioners, county auditors. And so even though we may not have the opportunity to vote in a fair way for Congress or the legislature, we still need to have those votes go for the local. So as some politicians said years ago, all politics is local. So let's keep that in mind as we vote this November.
And
Thanks.
I just want to second that thought. Remember, okay, this whole gerrymandering thing relates to the House of Representatives, the U.S. House, the U.S. Congress, and the Ohio legislature. But there are other statewide candidacies that you can vote for. The Ohio Supreme Court, okay, we just talked about how important that has been, at least pulling the veil back from the political corruption that has occurred with the gerrymandering process. There are local races, mayors, city councils, your school boards. There's a state education position that sets standards for Ohio for education in our public schools. So there are many, many races, and they are not gerrymandered. So those statewide races, governor, all the statewide races are important, and U.S. Senator, of course. So please, don't get discouraged, get mad, and use that energy to make some changes, and we'll need to do that going forward. And so we wanted to use this forum as a way to frame the issue for you and to energize you to make those reforms. For example, a citizen-directed redistricting commission in the future. So let's have questions. Raise your hand, and when you make your question, tell us who you're directing the question to, and speak loudly so everyone can hear. Go ahead.
My question's either for Catherine Turcer or Gary. And we talked a lot about Democrats and Republicans, but the reality is, when it comes down to it, by registration, there's a larger group of unclassified or independent voters that choose not to pick either party and don't participate in primaries. They are totally left out of the equation. Now, the one thing that people don't realize is while we elect county coroners, county engineers, we elect school boards, 608 of them. We only elect one official to oversee elections in the entire state, the Secretary of State. All elections are run by boards of elections in local counties, run by political parties who select the people to run the Board of Elections based on another gerrymander that we haven't talked about, another districting, which is local precincts and how they fill those seats. And people are totally unaware of precinct captains voting in a party to pick the people that then run the elections, who allow access to the ballot by how many signatures they accept or what fault they find on the ballot. So we don't get candidates even on the ballot who are trying to get on the ballot if they are not
Sir,
part of one or the other.
Could
Well,
you please frame a question?
The question is, maybe the problem is that we're allowing the Democrats and the Republicans to do this, and the real answer is we need ranked choice voting and equal ballot access for every candidate to solve this problem, because otherwise we'll never get anything but the two parties. The system is rigged. You need 5,000 signatures to get on the ballot to run for county
Okay, the
commission if
question
you're not a
is,
Democrat or Republican.
How do we have a system in which the two major political parties don't dominate the process? Is that the question?
Yeah, and that we can get candidates that are outside of those two parties.
Okay.
And Gary has suggested that ladies get to go first. What I was going to say is, it is completely true that we are not a chocolate and vanilla world. We are not left or right. We are all sorts of things in between, and we're not just Democrats and just Republicans, or just left and just right. And that kind of thinking is problematic, and we should be thinking about it as a systemic kind of reform. So today we talked about redistricting reform. But other days, we should talk about kind of election administration. We've used this kind of Noah's Ark system where the Democrats watch the Republicans watch the Democrats, and it's worked pretty well at rooting out problems. You can think of, remember the Chads in Florida, where one political party was responsible for all the decisions related to an election, and that's really problematic. But we should also be thinking about things like, well, how do we do our primaries? Should we do top two? Should we be thinking about ranked choice voting? Who here would like to amend the Constitution so that money does not equal speech? I mean, we could stay here until this time next week talking about all the different ideas that we have for reforming the system. So I would encourage each of us, pick your passion and get to work doing it. And I encourage all of us to vote.
And implicit in your question, well, it's not implicit, it's obvious, the Board of Elections is comprised of members from two political parties. And that's the balance. That's not the electorate. 2012 was derailed by both political parties. There's so much truth in what you said and what you asked.
Thank
And
you.
also, just to make a comment, the League of Women Voters is, at Ohio, is looking into ranked choice voting and doing a study about that. If you want to look at how that impacted partisanship and extremism in elections, you can look to the elections in Alaska and Maine this last cycle, and that will give you some idea about ranked choice voting. So the League of Women Voters continues to look at different kinds of reforms too. Any other questions? Yes.
You talked about Michigan having the.
Can you stand up and, please, could you stand up and?
I don't speak any louder standing up. You talked about Michigan having the ability to have citizens controls, and that right now there's potential case going to the Supreme Court. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, yeah, Michigan has a system like we should have.
Right, but
And
there
it looks
is-
like it works so far.
Right, but there is a case
Well,
somewhere.
the state legislature state theory, where a legislature is the beginning and end of all consideration of elections, is what is going to the Supreme Court.
Right, so if that
Oh,
would happen.
United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, so if that does happen, states like Michigan or California, they just totally then have to change.
Now, that'd be real interesting to see what happens there, because it's not the legislature that put that system in place.
Right.
And again, throw out electors, take an alternate slate, because I have the power in Georgia or Arizona or somewhere. It's a very frightening potential.
Yes, it's very, very frightening. And if you haven't heard about this theory, you should maybe do some more research on it. Yes.
So with the mandatory guidelines that were put into the Constitution and then completely not followed, is there a way to follow up with the state of, like, you didn't follow the guidelines, how do you make sure you follow the guidelines this next time? Like, throw them in their face, print paper copies of them, like, what is to
What's
be
the
done?
remedy for the fact that
Yes,
that
they
the
didn't follow
Supreme,
the
Ohio
guidelines.
Supreme Court found the maps unconstitutional?
Yeah,
Okay.
essentially.
I'm going to leave it to the legal scholars because I can't deal with the cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
I can't deal with the fact that we put it in the Ohio Constitution and they're not just doing it.
The problem is there's no teeth. There's no teeth in that constitutional amendment. And for over 20 years, we've been told our school funding is unconstitutional. What have we done about that? Nothing.
Maybe they also have been wearing orange suits, that might help.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, if Gary would have done something in the court defying the judge and being in contempt, the marshal would become, they would handcuff him and take him down to jail
Yes.
until he complies with the judge's order. I think That's what the Supreme Court should have done.
Yes.
Say, take them down, put them in the jail until they do the right thing.
Yes.
So it didn't happen.
We don't want to start the chance of lock them up. But I have heard that. I have heard that.
Diane.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
So my question is directed to Common Cause and League of Women Voters. We all have limited time, we all have limited resources. So what specifically are the next steps that you're going to do that we can get behind? I'm glad to hear you're considering ranked choice voting. I was a firm believer in gerrymandering right from the beginning, putting out signs when the referendum was, everybody's eyes glazed over and we knew it was probably going to fail. But with the Supreme Court decision coming up, I'm beginning to think if that happens, we're going to have to give up on redistricting and start looking at other solutions like ranked choice voting or nonpartisan primaries of some sort. So I'd like to know, where are you going? Are you going to wait until after the Supreme Court decision in October and then regroup? What are those two organizations' priorities?
So one of the things that we're doing is actually trying to plot out how it is that we can win. Because, you know, when we go back and we look at all of the things that happened in 2012, we can learn from them, if you want to call them mistakes. We can learn from the kind of strategies that we use, the kind of attacks like faceless bureaucrats, and we can think about how we want to educate people. We can review the reform. So like some of the policy things that are being debated and discussed and somewhat behind the scenes, but will certainly be, speaking of timing, y'all should be focusing on the election, getting voters registered and getting people to the polls, encouraging people to participate in those Supreme Court elections. But later on, we need to have a serious conversation. Should we do 12? Do 12 members of a redistricting commission? Is it enough people to be diverse enough to reflect the diversity of Ohio? How should we select them? So like in Michigan, they do it like a jury selection. Or should we do what California has, which is more of a situation where people write essays and there's a whole process of selection? There are policy decisions that need to be made, but the biggest decisions have to do, how are we going to educate people and get people ready? And we need to think about, if you wanted to be on the 2023 ballots, we would need signatures around the 4th of July. Meaning, we really need that summer for signature gathering. So when people are like, I personally want to pick my clipboard up today, but I don't just want to get on the ballot, I want to win. And so it's going to take time to get a bunch of folks and a bunch of organizations on the same page so we can move ahead.
There's a criticism of the League of Women Voters in that we're so methodical, we study things to exhaustion, but actually that is part of the process. And so the League of Women Voters is taking a very serious look at this at the state level and doing what Catherine said. You have to look at what your messaging is. You have to look at the type of reform you want to do, what fits Ohio best. Does the Michigan model better than the California model in terms of what Ohioans would prefer? So we do things in a very methodical way. We study them to exhaustion, but that's because we do want to win, and we don't give up. So we've been at this for over 40 years. We're going to continue the fight. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question regarding on the ballot coming up in November. There are two issues. Issue one, issue two. Is that something I can ask about?
The voter's guide will have will address that, and the League of Women Voters of Ohio will give you information so that you can make a decision on your own.
Well, I understand that. My question is the very creative wording, the very artistic, creative wording of issue one. It basically is saying that judges have to be mindful of whether or not an individual poses a risk to their community in determining bail, whether or not, depending on the offense, the criminal offense, again, in determining the bail. But don't the judges already take that into consideration when they're determining the bail? Isn't that one of the standards? Yes, no?
Absolutely.
Okay, so then why is this issue on? Because it makes it sound like this is going to make us safer in our communities, because now these crazy maniacal criminals won't be banging down our doors killing us because judges have just said, well, I like your shirt. Okay, you can have bail. You can have $5 bail. Go ahead, go out. So if there's already a system in place, then why the issue?
It's a dog whistle.
Explain.
It's a chance to encourage voters to come out where they're worried about results of an election. And it's a chance to head off the reform efforts on bail, that Tom's so very aware of and been involved in those efforts. They've gone on for 2 years, so they go, all right, we can get it on the ballot, and we're gonna change the game. It will pass. It says to protect the public, safety. It's gonna pass. There's nothing anybody can do about it, but it's unnecessary, and it's to bring out voters. Judges that think there's a risk to the community don't give bail. There's no amount of bail. So it's silly. But
There will
it's
be,
scary.
as I said before, there will be pros and cons to flesh that issue out. And it is, issue one is something that you do need to pay attention to, because it could be a wolf in sheep's clothing, as some people seem to indicate. So, you know, you have to be careful about what sounds good may not necessarily in reality work out for equity.
Not on this topic, Diane, but there is redistricting on the state school board. And we kind of thought, okay, that was a no, but they have redrawn some of our state school board districts. And I think Cleveland and Medina and I think Columbus believe that they will not be able to elect who they want to the school board. So the governor, I think it was charged with doing it. But at any rate, that's something we need to pay attention to. There is redistricting going on the state school board. That kind of was off the radar until it happened, and then we said, uh-oh.
How do you figure out what's going on with that? Because I've tried a little and I haven't been able to.
It's 3 Senate districts, right, Catherine? 3 Senate districts make up a school board district. I think ours is this district is pretty much won't change. But where it's changing, I think it's in the Cleveland, Medina, maybe Columbus area. And it was those three school board members who voted against the resolution that was talking about fairness in the system. And so it was those 3 school board members who were targeted specifically. So we never thought about school boards being redistricted. I remember you bringing it up in one of our conversations, and we just go, okay. But
Well,
it really is happening now.
Well, and also, like, we're talking about 3 Senate districts, right? Well, if there are 3 unconstitutional Senate districts,
Right, right.
then it's not fair, period, anyway. And so we should be on the alert for the manipulation of district lines, and including appeals court. They have not been changed in 40 years, but there are conversations about changing the appeal courts districts as well.
And I think that brings us to our closing statement, which is a very simple one. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and the cost of democracy is constant vigilance. And for our closing remarks, I'd like to introduce Chris Corba, our Executive Director at the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton Area, for the evening's closing.
First of all, thank you all for coming tonight. I think that when we planned this program, that we knew people would be interested, but I had no idea that it would be standing room only. So This is amazing, that there are so many people that really care about democracy, so thank you for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. I just want to say, and to reiterate what our panelists said, you need to get involved. You need to vote. You need to do your homework. You need to ask questions. And you need to really educate yourself so that you are voting for the person who most closely aligns with your feelings and your values. I did want to mention, as far as your question about issue 1, during this event, we were also producing a program on DATV with Patrick Higgins of the ACLU, and he is addressing issue 1 and explaining what it means and what goes on with that particular piece of legislation. You will be able to get that information on our website in another couple of days once the program has been uploaded. If you would like to join the League of Women Voters, we would love to have you join us. The League of Women Voters is open to anyone who is over the age of 16. We started bringing men into the fold in 1974, so it's not only women who may join the League of Women Voters. And Mr. Turner, Mr. Leppla, both proud members of the League of Women Voters, and we're happy to have them with us. And as Diane mentioned, the voter's guide will come out the week of October 10th. And as always, if you have questions, please call the League. We are your League. We are here to help you to navigate through this election time. So if you call us, we'll answer your question as best we can. And finally, I want to reiterate that the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We neither endorse nor oppose any candidate. The election materials, the campaign materials that you received were not distributed by the League and do not indicate our support for the candidate. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Drive safely and vote.